Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Functional Formulary webinar on common micronutrient deficiencies and effective corrective measures. I am Mark Pettis. I serve as the medical director for functional formularies, and I also serve as director of medical education and population health at Berkshire Health Systems in Western Massachusetts. And I'm grateful that you have taken time out of your busy, hectic day to tune in, and hopefully we'll get some meaningful news to use that can help you in the work that you do and those that you serve. I want to remind our listeners that this webinar will be recorded and should be available on the Functional Formulary website within 24 hours. And also your continuing education credits will be emailed to you within 24 hours. So please do anticipate that. So like so many things in healthcare these days, and I've been in practice for 30 years, I'm always amazed when I review a topic in more depth as to how much many of the assumptions that I have held true for a long time are really beginning to look and feel quite different. And one of those assumptions for me that has changed in recent years is the assumption that if a person is eating a reasonably well-balanced diet, they are likely assured to be getting the appropriate micronutrients that they need to prevent deficient states. And the research would suggest that for most of us is no longer an assumption we can hold to with as an absolute truth. And there are many things that we'll review here the time that we have that even in a balanced diet may not assure that we're getting the appropriate micronutrients. So we will look at that in a little more detail. So our learning objectives here are to review the prevalence of important nutrient deficiencies in the general population, and this is US data, and a lot of this data, as you'll see, comes from the NHANES surveys as well as from the Center for Disease Control. I want to spend a little time reviewing the contributing factors to this growing prevalence of important nutrient deficiencies. And then lastly, we'll look at some whole food and supplement considerations for addressing these common nutrient deficient states. So these are a list of the essential micronutrients, and essential implying that we cannot synthesize these. We have to get these from the foods that we eat. And there are approximately 40 or so. And I know you're all well familiar with the various vitamins and important minerals, but also the omega-3 and omega-6 essential fatty acids, as well as many amino acids that we rely upon our diet for adequate nutritional and metabolic support. And this will come as no surprise to you. If you look at the standard American diet, over half of the energy that we obtain, the average American obtains, is from refined and processed foods. And as you all know, these foods have minimal nutrient density, they're calorically dense, and they have significantly perpetuated what have been declines in important essential micronutrients. And if you look at the extent to which Americans consume the recommended daily servings of vegetables, less than 14%, despite widespread public health messaging, we just struggle in our ability to help others appreciate the value of consuming more plant-based foods, and less than 18% of Americans consume the recommended daily servings of fruits. And if you look at the top 10 sources of calories in the US diet, this was from 2010 research, it's kind of a stunning top 10, right? These are mostly grain-based, processed flour-based foods, which I find is really one of the fault lines in the standard American diet, fueling so much of our epidemics of obesity and insulin resistance and inflammation, yeast breads, chicken dishes, soda, energy, sports drinks. This is in the top 5. Pizza, alcohol, pasta. This is a really sobering top 10 list of go-to food and beverage choices for those that we serve. And if you look at, this is some interesting data. I do a lot of work in population health, and I share this research with my physician colleagues often. If you look at 4 critical lifestyle attributes or metrics, and we can all look at these and say, yeah, this is really where the rubber meets the road, whether it's smoking, physical activity is defined by 30 minutes a day of at least walking 5 days a week, daily consumptions of at least 5 pieces of fruits and vegetables, and alcohol consumption, anything more than moderation. And if you look at people, how they respond to whether or not they comply with these guidelines, again, not surprisingly, the results are pretty sobering, particularly when you look at the recommendations for the daily consumption of at least 5 servings of fruits and vegetables. And so here's some data from Health Partners. This is the largest health system in the state of Minnesota. Over 2 million people were tracked in their databases, looking at how commonly their 2 million participants followed all 4 of those conditions. And 13% of their 2 million cohort would have responded affirmatively to all 4 of those lifestyle attributes. 83, almost 84% did not meet the criteria for optimal lifestyle management in terms of 5 servings of fruits and, I think more importantly, vegetables each day. Not surprising when you look at that to begin to appreciate the prevalence and risk of important micronutrient deficiencies. We also know from an enormous amount of epidemiologic data that people who achieve 3 or 4 of those optimal lifestyle metrics compared to people who don't have dramatic risk reductions in most chronic complex diseases, from cardiovascular diseases to diabetes, to pain, to cancer, to other cardiometabolic risk factors like hypertension and dyslipidemia. It's stunning when one looks at the extent to which lifestyle fuels chronic complex disease and the ongoing gap, despite widespread public health messaging, that people continue to struggle in their ability to comply or successfully achieve those recommendations. So much more has changed in terms of just the processing of the foods in our diet and the lack of nutrient density. We know that agricultural techniques have changed considerably, and we've gone into really big agricultural business that has produced a more limited amount and diversity of crop commodities, that many of which are genetically modified, many of which do not practice restorative soil techniques. And the consequence of that is that the nutrient density of many of our fruits and vegetables has declined over the last generation or 2. And this was some research that looked at almost over 50 years from the USDA, looking at various garden crops and commodities. They looked at 43 and very rigorously tracked and measured changes in the nutrient density of these crops over that time frame. And what they found is that several essential micronutrients are much less concentrated in many of these commonly consumed fruits and vegetables, from decreases in calcium, phosphorus, iron, vitamin A, riboflavin, vitamin C, ascorbic acid. Nobody would deny the fact that there have been dramatic declines in nutrient density by virtue of how we grow the foods that we ultimately consume. And none of this takes into account the changes in the microbiome the soil where our produce is produced. And we, a few webinars ago, talked about the importance of the microbiome. And again, agricultural techniques, many of which employ genetic modification and heavy use of glyphosate, which is an antimicrobial, have not only changed the quality of the soil in terms of nutrients. Glyphosate is also a chelator of important minerals. It will strip them out of the soil and therefore out of the produce. But in addition, those residues we know can affect the microbiome of those who consume these foods. So it's really the perfect storm in terms of how consumers are being impacted by changes in big agricultural methodology. Now, I just wanted to review with you, and I know you're all aware of some of the current language, the recommended dietary allowance, the RDA, which are dietary intakes that are sufficient to meet virtually the needs of most people, 97, 98% of individuals in a particular group, and how that differs, for example, from the estimated average requirement, the EAR, which is a nutrient intake value that is estimated to meet the requirements of half the healthy individuals in a group. Adequate intake, this is a value based on really experimental approximations of nutrient intake where the RDA cannot be determined. And then there is this tolerable upper intake level where the highest levels of nutrient intake may begin to, beyond a certain threshold, create risk. And I think this terminology can be a little bit confusing, particularly to physicians who aren't always familiar with the difference between an EAR and an RDA. And it's very important when you're looking at any study to understand these differences, because there are many aspects of a person's unique metabolic needs that may put them in an EAR sufficient state, but still may not be giving them sufficient micronutrient concentration to optimally perform metabolically. And an important area of research that I wanted to bring to your attention is that of Bruce Ames, who's in Oakland, California, and has one of the most widely published researchers in the United States over the last 30 plus years. And Dr. Ames developed a theory known as the Triage Theory. And essentially the Triage Theory suggests that because of chronic complex disease metabolic environments that are often associated by increases in inflammation and increases in oxidative stress and free radical production, increases in the stress response and insulin resistance, that the metabolic needs of an individual who is confronting those chronic metabolic disruptors will tend to triage micronutrients, particularly when intake is limited, as is the case for most of those people confronting those chronic complex diseases. They'll tend to triage those micronutrients to areas that really are necessary for surviving the day. And they will forego those metabolic processes, reproductive capacity, for example, that may not be essential for survival in that moment. So our metabolic needs will very much be influenced in terms of the overall metabolic landscape, and what might otherwise be sufficient from an estimated requirement perspective may not be sufficient for that individual whose metabolic demands are quite high on a chronic basis. And we know that many of these micronutrient deficiencies that emerge over long periods of time can be associated with DNA damage or failure to adequately repair DNA, suboptimal responses to oxidative stress and free radical neutralization, cell signaling, mitochondrial function, et cetera, et cetera. So these are not innocuous deficiency states. And unlike what I was taught in medical school, where a nutrient deficiency was usually defined by an acute severe deficiency and an acute manifestation of that deficiency, like scurvy for vitamin C or beriberi for thiamine. We don't see those disease states as we once did. Instead, what we are now seeing, and this is aligned with Bruce Ames' triage theory, are people that have micronutrient deficiencies over long periods of time that ultimately interfere with their ability to function optimally, increasing their risk for chronic complex diseases like cardiovascular disease, cancer, and Alzheimer's. This is a very different manifestation of suboptimal nutrition than one would have seen a century ago, where these were more short-term acute micronutrient deficient states. And then there's a third category of nutrient status that takes you beyond what is necessary to prevent disease. And this brings us into really this notion of creating health, creating optimal function in ways that allow you to perform better, to think more clearly, to be more creative, to rally more quickly after exercise, to take a hit, and to become more metabolically resilient in response to that hit. And so this is a bit more of a nuanced way of looking at the link between micronutrient intake, disease risk, and ultimately quality of life. And so it changes the sort of conventional view that I had when I got out of medical school and when I was practicing nephrology. And I now do more integrative medicine and community-based population health work. But you were either below the RDA and that old paradigm and that danger, or you were well above that RDA and in a safe range, as opposed to what I believe is a more accurate view of nutrient intakes, where being at the estimated average recommendation may serve the mean or the median, but for 50% or more will still be insufficient to meet their unique metabolic needs. In much the same way, someone may be getting an RDA intake, but if they're confronting some unique chronic metabolic conditions like unabated stress or post-traumatic stress or chronic sleep disruption, or they have a SNP for methylene tetrahydrofolic acid reductase, their unique metabolic needs. And I'll talk about nutrigenomics as we wind this presentation down toward the end. But we now know individuals, either on a genetic basis or a unique environmental challenge basis, may require more than what the RDA recommendations suggest in order to achieve that optimal functional state, which is unique to them. So it's a more nuanced way of matching nutrient requirements with the unique genotype and phenotype of that individual. Much more shades of gray than black and white, which is so true of everything now in the care that we provide. And this slide is really just a summary of those points, that people have biochemical individualization, which might include an MTHFR SNP, that an RDA intake of B12 or folate for that individual may be insufficient. We know that, and again, sort of coming back to Bruce Ames' triage theory, that compressing morbidity, and this is a concept that goes back to the early 80s. The New England Journal of Medicine published a landmark study that suggested that this inexorable decline as we get older, where our quality of life goes down and we're likely to get more chronic complex disease, has become so common that we assume that to be the normal natural trajectory of the average American. And if you are in your 50s and and you look around and you see that what's happening to you is happening to everyone else, it's natural to perceive that you're just a member of the club, and this is just the price to pay for getting older. When you begin to look at food as medicine, and particularly with respect to the importance of nutrient density and matching the unique needs of an individual, it's increasingly clear that we can compress morbidity in a way that would allow a person to have a much better quality of life throughout most of their life expectancy. Inevitably confronting something that's acute and perhaps catastrophic. So the intention here is to help a person improve their health span, which is very different. It's a bit of a different proposition than helping someone avoid a nutrient deficient state. So our goal is always to assist in achieving the best optimal biologic function, understanding that many deficiencies will be relative, and it's important to be thinking along those lines. And we know that our metabolic landscape will shift dramatically. If somebody is being treated for cancer and they're getting chemotherapy and radiation, they perhaps are undergoing surgery. These are very catabolic states that are associated with high degrees of oxidative stress and inflammation and wound healing challenges. So we know that an individual's metabolic demand and their nutrient needs as a consequence will be very different during those periods than they may have been otherwise. So these are dynamic landscapes, as you know. And then lastly, I wanted to emphasize that I think it's really important that we think about micronutrient sufficiency or states beyond just these vitamins and minerals and essential fatty acids and essential amino acids, to be much more mindful of fermentable fiber and phytonutrients. We don't have RDAs or EARs for phytonutrients, for polyphenols or flavonols. We have guidelines for recommendations of fermentable fiber that for many people are still well below what is necessary to achieve optimal health. And I think fiber is probably an essential food group that we all need to be more mindful of, and particularly when you start to bring the microbiome into the complexity of human biology and human health. And I think what makes nutrition so amazingly interesting in 2017, beyond just whether you're getting enough to avoid a deficient state or not, is really epigenetics and the microbiome. This has totally changed the paradigm when you begin to consider the fact that fiber and phytonutrients can alter gene expression patterns in addition to altering the diversity and complexity and balance of one's gastrointestinal ecosystem, and the extent to which we are gaining more understanding of the importance of epigenetic modulation and microbiologic modulation as important and critical and malleable opportunities through food to influence human biology. And as I like to share with our residents, your biology becomes your biography. And here, fiber and phytonutrients are such an important part of that nutritional mosaic. Now, just jumping to some more recent data, and again, this is from some NHANES data, 2001, 2008. This is the most recent NHANES analysis, and this was published by Agrawal in 2014. He looked at the percentage, this was a population study, of individuals who fell below the EAR for critical micronutrients. And he looked at the prevalence of this in people at a normal weight, people who were overweight, and people who were obese, as defined in his study, as true in most studies, of a BMI greater than 30. If you look at all people included in this study, you see a very high percentage of people are below the EAR for vitamin A, for vitamin C, these fat-soluble vitamins, vitamin D and vitamin E, minerals like calcium, magnesium, and even zinc, though a little bit below that 20th percentile. And this is looking at EAR. These are levels that would meet the needs of 50% of the population, and several critical micronutrients at the EAR measure fall well below that in terms of intake, which would suggest that there are probably even more that are well below the RDA for those micronutrients. And when you look at those where intake is well below the EAR, and on this slide, for each of these micronutrients, on the left, the lighter bar are people of normal weight. The middle bar, the grayish bar, are people who are overweight, and the dark black bar, people who are obese. And for each of these micronutrients, you do see some trends where as you go from a normal weight to obesity, there is a linear increase in the percent of those that fall into those subcategories that are below EAR with their day-to-day diets. Now, it's hard to know what this means. There are some who might say, well, micronutrient deficiencies may be a model for obesity, and there's a school of thought that one of the many drivers of obesity is simply not getting enough micronutrients. Another school of thought would be that people who are obese are more likely to consume foods that, as we looked at the top of the hour, are foods that had limited nutrient density. So it would make sense that people with more weight are getting less nutrient-dense foods. So this is left to speculation, but the point is that many people, for many critical micronutrients, are well below where they need to be in terms of their day-to-day intake. Now, Agarwal also looked at important nutrients that, again, fall outside the category of essential. And these are nutrients like choline and fiber, as well as potassium. And again, same cohort. If you look at people who are getting sufficient choline, it's less than 8%. It's almost 6%. Another way to look at that is to say that almost 95% of Americans are not getting sufficient choline. Choline is a very important methylator. We'll look at good dietary and whole food sources of choline, but choline is very important for methylation, which is an essential aspect of epigenetic gene expression. Methylation is very important for detoxification, how well we biotransform and manage our toxin loads, very important for neurotransmitter function. So this is a very important nutrient that 90+% of Americans are not getting enough of. If you look at fiber, very similar story. Over 95% of Americans in this NHANES cohort are falling well short of adequate intake of fiber. And again, you do see this gradient from those of normal weight to those who are obese. But this I think is really a major public health issue. When you begin to look at the microbiome and fermentable fiber and the metabolic byproducts of fermentation in the gut, the short-chain fatty acids like butyric acid and acetic acid, this is a major public health issue. I think it's one of the points of emphasis that I'm always working with in medical education, and certainly the community outreach that we do and in the clients that I'm working with. And then there's potassium. And I'm struck as a renal guy. Nephrologists think a lot about potassium because if your GFR is low, you're at great risk of hyperkalemia, which can be life-threatening. And I've cared for many people whose potassiums have been so high that these individuals are literally paralyzed from the arms down and are often within hours of cardiac arrest. But for most of the rest of the population, potassium intake is woefully deficient. And as you all know, potassium is abundant. We'll look at some of these whole food sources, and many fruits and vegetables and many animal-based sources of foods. I often think when we talk about sodium gets so much attention, and I apologize to pontificate, but if you look at hypertension, in my humble objective opinion, hypertension is much more an issue of potassium deficiency than it is sodium excess. And though many people eating processed foods are getting too much sodium, sodium is really not the problem. It's potassium deficiency. And you won't see that in blood work. We'll look at blood tests in a moment, but the kidneys have a remarkable way of holding on to keep enough potassium in the serum, in the blood, to prevent a cardiac arrest. But most potassium is intracellular, and serum levels of potassium do not reflect intracellular or total body potassium in a very accurate way. So, and when you look at many diets like the DASH diet, the Mediterranean, which have been shown to improve blood pressure and improve insulin sensitivity, one of the distinguishing features, in addition to being more nutrient-dense nutritional programs, is that they're much, much higher in potassium. So when you look at this data and you consider the fact that 95, 96+% of all Americans are not getting enough potassium, not getting enough fiber, and oh, by the way, they come from the same sources and are not getting enough choline, it, in my view, places the emphasis and the focus in a slightly different way than one might focus on a very specific micronutrient. This is some recent data from the Center for Disease Control, and these are actual measurements using serum and urine testing. And again, about 90 million Americans, this is consistent with the Agarwal data from NHANES. About 90 million Americans are deficient in vitamin D, 30 million Americans deficient in vitamin B6, very important vitamin in terms of neurotransmitter production, in terms of detoxification, methylation. 18 million Americans deficient in B12, and this is using the methylmalonic acid testing, which is a more sensitive test than a B12 level for assessing functional B12 deficiency. 16 million Americans deficient in vitamin C, 8 million Americans deficient in iron, even more prevalent in younger kids. If you look at Latinos, 12%, Blacks, 16%, children less than 5 years of age, as much as 7 to 10% of young kids are deficient in iron, which, as you know, is critical to neurologic development, cognition, learning, etc. Lastly, from the CDC data, many women of reproductive age have borderline low iodine levels, and iodine is critical for fetal development, neurologic development, and most of the iodine that people get is from iodized salt, and the iodine in iodized salt has dropped considerably, and many people, because they restrict salt, are not getting iodine from other food sources. So I do think in this particular segment, younger women of reproductive age, that iodine levels is a very important issue to be thinking about. And this is some of the data looking at urine iodine excretion, and that's the current gold standard for looking at iodine status. And you can see that that critical reproductive age group is one where, and again, these are medians, are at or slightly below adequate intake. So the suggestion there is that a large percentage of women of reproductive age are probably not getting enough iodine to support their own health and that of fetus if they're planning a families or expecting children. I do think it's important, and I always think of my friend and colleague, Kathy Swift, extraordinary pioneer in nutrition, and Kathy's a friend and a colleague, and she's always, and I know her outreach for IFNA, the Integrative Functional Nutrition Academy, under the Academy, always reminding of the importance of looking for physical findings in the work that we do. And I can tell you many medical students and residents get little training these days, and the importance of the physical exam. That may stun some of you to hear that, but I do think that's the current reality. So I'm always interested in how a person perceives their night vision, making sure they're getting tested for that. When you look at the prevalence of vitamin A deficiency, it's really quite high. Cheilitis, often a manifestation of B12, B6, iron, zinc deficiencies. Glossitis, and not uncommonly, I will notice someone's tongue is inflamed, is a manifestation of various B vitamin deficiencies. A spooning of the nails, as you see on the lower left, is a manifestation of iron deficiency, and this white spotting, a manifestation of zinc deficiency. Easy bruising can be a vitamin K problem, and many of you I know are aware of the importance of vitamin D for muscle strength. I see a lot of elderly people, many of whom really cannot get out of a seated position without having to heavily rely on the handles of the chair and use of their arms. And many of these folks are sarcopenic and have limited core muscle muscle integrity. Vitamin D is important for maintaining that. Potassium, magnesium, for those that cramp, particularly overnight cramping, which can be really problematic for folks and can disrupt sleep patterns in a very significant way. And then this growing number of people that have restless leg syndrome and peripheral neuropathy, which outside of a diabetic etiology, often can point to micronutrient problems like iron, B12, and folate. So those are just some important signs and symptoms to be thinking about in those that you're partnering with. We also have this category of drug-nutrient interactions. And, you know, when you sit down with your clients and you just start looking at the incredible number of meds that people are taking, prescription and non-prescription, this polypharmacy is just so problematic. And so just a few, I think, highlights. So we know that alcohol can interfere with many of these micronutrients. Alcohol in the kidneys will interfere with optimal conservation of cations like magnesium and zinc, potassium, but it will also interfere with gastrointestinal absorption of many B vitamins, and including folate. Antibiotics and their effects on vitamin K producing bacteria can cause vitamin K deficient states, and so people that are on warfarin or Coumadin, will, many of whom have very steady INRs, will often be over-therapeutic when an antibiotic is introduced. And my own practice is not, in those individuals, is not to recommend that they defer from vitamin K-rich foods, which are so nutrient-dense, but to consume those foods, let them establish an equilibrium in terms of their INR on those nutrient-dense vitamin K foods, and then establish the appropriate dose response, as opposed to saying don't eat vitamin K containing foods because they'll interfere with your warfarin. But antibiotics can disrupt that equilibrium. Diuretics are, you know, as you all know, can affect potassium, particularly thiazide diuretics, hydrochlorothiazide, chlorthalidone, much more potassium wasting in the kidney than a loop diuretic like Lasix or furosemide. They will also impact magnesium, zinc, more so the loop diuretics with those minerals, because of where the loop diuretic acts in the kidney on the loop of Henle. And B vitamins as well can become deficient on diuretics. Metformin, widely prescribed and very effective for Usually insulin resistance and prediabetes can interfere with B12 absorption. This is very important. And you may have diabetics with peripheral neuropathy where the emphasis of the provider is more on glycemic control when the emphasis should be on looking for a B12 deficient state from the metformin that they're on for their diabetes. Trimethoprim, an antibiotic in Bactrim, for example, can interfere with the tetrahydrofolate metabolism and can create, usually over longer term. These are, in my experience, people on chronic trimethoprim for pneumocystis prophylaxis, for example, if they're HIV positive and have a very low lymphocyte count. And then a category that's substantial in and of itself are proton pump inhibitors. I think we're just looking at the tip of the iceberg here. I mean, almost everyone I see is on a PPI. Either it's being prescribed to them or they're getting it over the counter. Hardly anyone that I see is taking it for the FDA approved 4 to 8 weeks. As many of you know, people are on these meds for a long, long time. And we've evolved to produce acid in our stomach. And if you turn it off indefinitely, you are inevitably going to run into significant metabolic consequences. And so we know that PPIs will inhibit intrinsic factor, which is essential for vitamin B12 absorption, very common in chronic PPI users. Calcium, much better absorbed in the presence of acid. Eliminate acid production and you will decrease your calcium absorption. There are probably effects of PPIs on magnesium transport in the small intestine. Folic acid can be inhibited from chronic PPI use, as well as zinc, and even iron absorption. These divalent, these double-charged cations, minerals, magnesium, zinc, iron, very significantly impacted in people with chronic PPI use. And this is just a micronutrient concern. I'm not even addressing the effects on the microbiome and small intestinal bacterial overgrowth in people whose acid is suppressed. Acid is an important defense in inhibiting overgrowth of bacterial migration. So, it's easy for us in 2017 to look back at how medicine was practiced in 1900, and we might say, gee, what were they thinking back then? I predict 10, 15, 20 years from now, we're going to look back in 2017 and say, what were they thinking? And this is just part of the evolution of the work that we do and the importance of how everything we do has a consequence, and sometimes these are unintentional. Labs are obviously very important in addition to dietary diaries and surveys that you're collecting from individuals that you're serving. And these are labs that I know that you're familiar with, the 25-hydroxyvitamin D. Methylmalonic acid is very important along with B12 in blood testing, folate levels. I do think that the methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase SNP, and I have a slide on this as I conclude, is really important as it relates to appropriate methylation of folate. People with MTHFR and as many as 40–45% will have a SNP. Most of those are heterozygous and will have a 40% reduction in their ability to methylate folic acid into its more biologically active form. About 10% are homozygote, and they will have as much as a 70% reduction in their ability to methylate folic acid and cobalamin, B12. So that has implication for whether or not you would supplement with a methylated form. I think that's probably the most widely tested example of a nutrigenomic test that can identify an individual whose treatment plan will be impacted by the result of that test in the form of methylated B12 and folate of a much higher concentration than what you would ordinarily use to meet the recommended daily intake. Magnesium and zinc, also very important minerals, and red blood cell magnesium and zinc levels tend to correlate better with total body burden than a regular serum level. The omega-3 to 6 index, we talked about fats in April in the webinar we did. This is an index where you would like, and this is measuring red blood cell fatty acid content, which is really what you want to be looking at. Ideally, you would want that ratio to be 8% or higher, and using that as a guide to help people reduce what is often an excess of the omega-6 linoleic acid seed oils for the most part, and getting more of the omega-3 sources. Urine iodine, again, very important, particularly in women of reproductive age. And for those that may be familiar with functional testing, urinary organic acids, metabolic profiling can be very important. And though many people that I serve have very limited resources, so I try to be very conservative with testing, I do think that the bang for the buck with urinary organic acids and metabolic profiling can really be substantial. It gives you a nice snapshot of one's metabolic landscape, key metabolic bottlenecks that are occurring as a consequence of essential micronutrient deficient states. And almost always you can come up with a personalized nutritional, interventional, and supplement plan to help them respond to those unique metabolic needs. A question that comes up all the time, and I'm sure you get this, is should everyone be on a multivitamin mineral supplement? You know, based on this data, it would seem pretty clear that having some insurance policy would make some sense. When you look at the research, and this is a snapshot from one of my favorite websites, which is the NNT, the number needed to treat. In this example, if you look at most of the studies that have been published looking at vitamin and antioxidant supplements, in this instance for the primary prevention of cardiovascular disease, but the data is very similar for risk reduction in cancer, for the most part, these studies have not, in large populations, have not shown significant benefit globally, if you will. Now, people aren't harmed. There's very little downside. But I think what's important in extrapolating the research that's out there, the quote-unquote best evidence, is these are medians. This is looking at the medians of large populations. Clearly, we all know there are subsets of people in the general population that fall off the curve of the median who have unique nutritional and metabolic needs that a daily multivitamin mineral supplement would help provide. And Bruce Ames in his Triage Theory, I think, would corroborate that. So do I recommend multivitamin supplements in everyone? Not necessarily, but for the many people that I serve that have many social determinants of health, from limited health literacy to limited socioeconomic status and resources, often I will recommend they take a multivitamin mineral supplement to help meet unique needs that lifestyle may just not likely and realistically be able to provide. And I do think we're moving in this new world order from the median, which is what so much of our published research looks at, to the individuals, which, if anything from this talk, you can appreciate that being at the median from an American health and nutrient concentration perspective is probably not a very health promoting place to be. So these are just some great whole food sources of magnesium. And again, I know that many of you are aware of this, but in a food as medicine context, it really helps to guide people into a menu of whole foods that can help serve their needs, from, again, greens to beans, legumes, nuts, very good sources of magnesium. Choline-rich foods, again, choline, over 95% of Americans not getting enough of this very important methylating factor. And this comes more from animal source foods, as you can see. There are some plant-based sources that are important if a person is a vegetarian or vegan. Sometimes choline supplementation in that particular population may be very, very important if they're just not getting the dietary sources they would otherwise need to meet their choline needs. Zinc, again, many good sources, a lot of which are from animal sources, but also bivalves, nuts, dairy are very important sources of zinc. But this too may be a mineral that requires additional supplementation based on a person's dietary preferences and unique metabolic needs. I know that you're all aware of high potassium foods, and anytime I can get people to just eat more of those plant-based foods, I can assure them that their blood pressure, their insulin, all of the metabolic fault lines can be addressed in a much more meaningful way. Occasionally, I will supplement with potassium citrate. I do that more commonly in people who are kidney stone formers, who have to be careful with certain high potassium foods that also have more oxalate in them. But that's a very unique segment where I'm more likely to supplement with potassium. The other would be in thiazide diuretic users that almost always will benefit from some additional supplemental potassium citrate. We talked about the importance of fiber, right? And a couple of slides here from my friend Kathy Swift. And again, we don't have RDAs for prebiotics, so it's important to be thinking about foods that are fiber-rich, that can help support the human microbiome and the many complex and nuanced interactions through bacterial fermentation of these macrobiotic-associated carbohydrates. And again, there are just so many, as you all know, amazing whole food sources that are not only nutrient dense, but also address important fiber and prebiotic needs. Supplements to consider, again, even with the best of nutritional programs, these are some that I often fall back on. Magnesium in various forms. If somebody's renal function is okay, I'm always careful if they have stage 4 or beyond chronic kidney disease. But magnesium, so many people are deficient and would benefit. The same is true for zinc, carnosine. Vitamin D, sunshine is definitely the go-to source for this. That may be a webinar for another day. I have a strong interest in photobiology, and if you look at sulfation through ultraviolet B exposure, vitamin D through sunlight exposure is sulfated and probably has more bioavailability than what you get when you're taking cholecalciferol as a supplement. I think anything is better than nothing, but anytime you can get your vitamin D from optimal, sensible sunlight exposure, you're much better off. B complex, particularly methylated forms of B12 and folate for those that may have the MTHFR single nucleotide polymorphism, I think is a very important consideration, particularly for people dealing with depression or the other behavioral health, anxiety, PTSD. I think these are really important metabolic pathways from a mood and behavior perspective. And many people whose depression may not be responding to an antidepressant do very well if they're MTHFR positive, either heterozygote or homozygote, being put on a methylated form of B12 and folate. And again, potassium citrate is an occasional consideration. Special dietary nutrient considerations also important here, and I know that many of you are aware of this. For vegetarians, lacto-ovo vegetarians, restricting meat, poultry, seafood, the key nutrients of concern are going to be the omega-3 fats, iron and zinc. For the lacto and the ovo vegetarians, again, similar challenges in terms of meeting omega-3 needs. Zinc B12 needs as one becomes more restrictive of animal foods, and certainly vegans, most of whom over time will be at risk of deficiencies in calcium, iron, zinc, B12, vitamin D, omega-3 fatty acids, and in some instances, if they're not getting a diverse form of plant-based protein sources, may be at risk of some essential amino acid deficiencies. And again, I would never discourage a vegan or vegetarian lifestyle. It's just a matter of being mindful of where the deficient state risks are, monitoring that, and then supplementing as needed. And then lastly, in the last few minutes I want to just close with a few common nutrigenomic studies, some of which I've touched on. These, I think, are some of the more important SNPs. One is the vitamin D and the CYP2R1 SNP, which converts D3 into the 25-hydroxy D3. So occasionally I have somebody on a pretty high dose of D3. I check their 25-hydroxy levels, and they're not going up as I would expect. You know, on average, 1,000 units will increase D levels by about 5 nanograms per ml. If I don't see that, I become concerned about this SNP, and often they do require a higher dose to get through that metabolic bottleneck. The ApoE4, which is a potential risk for Alzheimer's, might influence somebody's LDL cholesterol levels, particularly if they're liberalizing their fat intake, which I think for most people is a good thing to do, particularly if they're healthy sources. But I will follow lipids more closely. And again, there the concern may be an accentuated elevation of their LDL cholesterol. And then the other SNP, again, I think the most important in terms of pragmatic application in 2017 is the folate and the MTHFR SNP, which we talked about. And virtually 40% of the population is heterozygote, which has about a 40% reduction in methylation, 10% homozygote with dramatic reductions in functional methylation of folic acid and cobalamin. Really important in people who are, again, confronting behavioral health, detoxification concerns. And there we have something we can offer. There are SNPs that one can see, the FUT2 SNP and B12 absorption. So again, I don't routinely measure this, but if somebody's not responding to B12 supplementation, I might put them on a sublingual form or a higher methylated form to override that. And then this last SNP is the BCM01, which is important for converting the carotenoids, the provitamin A carotenoids, to the active form of vitamin A. And adults tend not to do that well anyway, but anyone with these SNPs may need vitamin A if their ability to convert is limited. So that was a whirlwind tour of, I think, hopefully the current state of the art with respect to common micronutrient deficiencies and ways of thinking about individualization and personalized approaches to treatment, both dietary and perhaps supplementation. And this is a picture of a Shaker village here in the Berkshires where I live, a Shaker community that hasn't changed much over the last 200 years. And beautiful plants and sustainable gardens. And it reminds me of the potential we have to generate an abundance of much of what we need to thrive in life right in our own communities and right in our own backyards. And so much of the population health movement, in my view, is a democratization of care that is bringing that to the community level. The less reliant we are on government and certainly industry, I think the better off we all tend to be. So with that editorial, I thank you for listening. And I want to remind you that this recording will be available within 24 hours on the Functional Formulary website. And you'll be getting an email with your continuing education credit certificate. I thank you all for the work that you do and the service that you provide to others. Be well and stay well. Thank you.